Evening, everyone. Happy Pride. My name is Sydney Yeager, and I'm the Public Programs Coordinator at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. I'm so pleased to welcome you all to Transgender People, the Nazi State, and the Holocaust. Here at the museum, we are dedicated to our mission of educating our diverse community about Jewish life and heritage before, during, and after the Holocaust. As part of that mission, our programs are meant to illuminate the stories of survivors, broader histories of hate, bigotry, and anti-Semitism through time, and stories of resistance against injustice. Today, we will be discussing the experiences of transgender and non-binary folks in pre-war and Nazi Germany. We have talked before about this, along with the pink triangle and gay experiences specifically, but as the rights, healthcare access, and really the very existence of trans people are being viciously curtailed at the whim of legislation in the United States and around the world, it's important to delve into this history. We're so pleased to be here with scholar Laurie Marhoefer, who will share perspectives, experiences, and language about a topic that each of us understands and connects to in different ways. It's tricky to talk about people in the past with contemporary language that didn't exist at the time. We talk about this often at the museum in our programs, exhibitions, and more. So we're so grateful to Laurie and to all of you for navigating this with us. So now I'm going to introduce you all to our speaker. Laurie is the John Bridgman Endowed Professor of History at the University of Washington. His work has been influential in international debates about the Nazi state and lesbians and transgender people, and in the public memory of the early gay rights movement, Magnus Hirschfeld and the Weimar Republic. He is the author of 2 books, most recently a biography of Hirshfeld and his student Li Shiu Tong. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Racism and the Making of Gay Rights, a Sexologist, His Student, and the Empire of Queer Love, and of a number of essays and articles on queer and trans histories. If you have questions for Laurie during the program, please put them in the Zoom Q&A box and we'll get to as many as we can at the end of the hour. Thank you all so much for joining us today. And now I'm going to hand things over to Laurie.
Hey, thanks, Sydney. Thanks, Sydney and Ariel for bringing me in to do this talk. I'm really excited. Happy Pride, everybody. Thank you for coming. Let me just, okay, I'm just going to throw my slides up. Hang on. Here. Okay. It's great to be talking at the Museum of Jewish Heritage. Okay, so yeah. So I'm going to talk about transgender people in the Nazi period, and I'm going to start out by giving you some background about the history of transgender people before the Nazi state, because there's actually like a surprisingly rich history there, and it's part of what was so horrible about Nazi Germany is how drastically things changed for trans people who had lived under a more tolerant regime. Oh, these are, sorry, this is like shameless self-promotion. These are my 2 books. But I'm now working on a book on like trans histories. And some of the stuff in this talk will go in that book. Okay, so to sort of skip over to New York in 1969, a lot of people think of gay history as starting with the Stonewall Rebellion, and you may have heard of it. And I definitely recommend looking up the drunk history version of the Stonewall Rebellion. It's really great reenactment. But actually, gay and trans history go back like over 100 years before Stonewall. So for trans people, a really important early development is the work of this guy, Magnus Hirschfeld. He was not trans, he was a cisgender guy. He was quietly gay, not in public, but in private. He was a German Jewish doctor who was born in the last third of the 19th century. And he became famous in Germany even before, before the First World War as an expert on sex and gender. He eventually went on a tour of the United States in the early 1930s, and he was known in the American press as the Einstein of sex. That's when Albert Einstein was living in California and was also famous as this like pioneering scientist. And I think that's a good way to think of Hirschfeld, that he was somebody who was recognized as this new scientific thinker on sex and gender, not just on homosexuality and on transvestites, but that was one of his specialties. He also wrote a lot about eugenics. He wrote about women's reproductive health. He wrote about like divorce and marriage law. He had broad interests. But he's really well remembered today as one of the first gay activists in the world. And he's remembered for his model of what homosexuality was. I put it up on the slide for you here. It's the biological model you're probably familiar with it. It just says that, like, if you're gay, you're born gay, you can't change, and that condition is not a mental illness. It's due to some kind of biological condition, but it's not a pathology. He had a similar model of what he called transvestitism, which I'm going to talk about, like, what is that? Is it transgender? Okay. But sort of hold that thought. But this biological model, like, now a lot of people believe this, but when Hirschfeld first published it in the late 19th century, it was like a really new idea. Okay, so for our purposes, his most important book was this one, came out in 1910. It was called The Transvestites, The Erotic Urge to Cross-Dress. This is a picture of him in the 1920s at his scientific institute in Berlin, which I'll talk a little bit about in a second, at a conference. But then here's the title page of the book, The Transvestites. So this book is important in trans history because it's, to our knowledge, it's the first time in history that anyone published the idea that trans people were not just gay people, that they were this special kind of other group of people. And in it, Hirschfeld uses the biological model to explain what it means to be a transvestite. He's like, this is something people are born with, and what it is a very strong, like, immutable, basic identification as the sex that is not your birth assigned sex. So Sydney said a little bit about, like, how the terminology can be confusing, and this is really like the place in my talk today where it can be a little confusing, because today transvestites, or being a transvestite, is not a term that transgender people like to use for ourselves. A lot of people would find that offensive, and it also doesn't really mean what transgender means. So transvestite today means people who like to cross-dress for different reasons, but it's not like, they're not generally living their entire life as the sex that is not their birth assigned sex. Okay, so the confusing thing is that in the 1920s and the 1930s and the 1940s, transvestite meant what transgender means to us today. The meaning has really changed. Part of what happened is, like, we got the word transsexual, and then we got the word transgender, and transvestite took on a different meaning. But in the 1930s, 1920s, it really meant transgender. Let me give you an example. So if you read Hirschfeld's book, and there is an English translation, shout out to Michael Lombardi Nash, who translated it. If you read through the cases, people who identify themselves as transvestites and who Hirschfeld calls transvestites, when they describe their lives, they're basically describing what it means to be a transgender person. They're not describing, like, oh, I really like to cross-dress at parties, or, like, you know, for fun or for erotic reasons. They're people who are living their entire life as much as they can as the sex that was not their birth assigned sex. So this is one of his cases. He uses female pronouns for this person, which he really should be using male pronouns for this person. But this is a guy who identifies as a guy, and is living as, and has from childhood, and as much as possible is living as a guy. I don't know if you want to take a moment to just take a look at it. This is someone who never felt, right, so was assigned female at birth, but has never felt himself to be female, uncomfortable in women's clothing. Look at some of the other things that come up in this. You know, something that really struck me when I read it is that Hirschfeld writes that when he met this person, quote, "We in no way had the impression that a woman was standing in front of us in men's clothing, but rather the impression of a young man, about 18 to 20 years old, with somewhat feminine facial expressions." And also, it's like, it's about more than clothing for this person. So this person has male hobbies. This person would like to have a masculine first name. So if you are trans, or you've read about, like, what it's like to be trans, it's a lot like what is being described here, although they're using the term transvestite. So historians, having looked through the archive, were like, at this point, we're like, transvestite in this time period basically means what transgender means to us. The meanings are very, very similar. Okay. And I just want to draw your attention to one more thing in this source. You can see in the bottom, like, what this trans man wants is to get a petition that will allow him to wear men's clothing and to change his first name. So in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, those were the two most important things for trans people: to get a permit so that the police could not arrest you for cross-dressing, and to change your first name. The 1920s, 1930s, 1940s were a time when clothing was much more gendered than it is today. And also where the world of work was super gendered and, of course, like super sexist. So if you were a man if you were identified as a man, living your life as a man, and you had a female first name, it could make it really impossible to get a job, because when you showed up, they're like, yeah, we'll hire you to like lay bricks. Oh, wait, your name is Charlotta. Like, that's what's going on, right? So unemployment is a problem that comes up again and again for trans people in this period, and the stuff that I've read. And then the other thing, of course, is that like the police could arrest you if you appeared in public in the clothing of your actual sex, if your birth assigned sex was different from your actual sex. So even before the First World War, Magnus Hirschfeld pioneered this system of appealing to the police in different German cities to issue what were called transvestite certificates to allow people to wear the clothing of their self-confirmed sex. I have a photo of one, which I'll show you, but let me just pause on this picture. This is some trans people in front of Hirshfeld's Institute for Sexual Science in Berlin at a conference. We don't have that many photos from this time period, and we don't have that many photos of trans people. So this is like a super cool source to see these people. And it's a really good photo. Like the image quality is very good. You can really see them, which I think is cool. But anyway, so let me show you a transvestite certificate here. Hang on. This is Gerd Katter's permit. He was a trans guy who was relatively young in the 1920s, and then lived quite a while, lived through the Second World War, and then donated his papers. So we know a lot about him. And he worked with Hirschfeld, and Hirschfeld helped him get a permit to wear men's clothing, which was huge for him, right? It kind of made life possible for him. These permits were super important. So this system of like transvestite certificates or permits dates back to prior to the First World War. And then in the 1920s and the 1930s, lots of people seem to have gotten these certificates. I've seen it on a lot of files that people had a permit to quote unquote cross-dress. Okay, let me. So Hirschfeld, after the First World War, Germany had a democratic regime called the Weimar Republic, and it was super friendly to Hirschfeld. This was like a heyday for him and generally for like queer and trans subcultures in Germany. In the 1920s, under this democratic regime, Germany was the most open place in the world, probably for queer and trans people, particularly in the big cities like Hamburg and Berlin. And Hirschfeld was able to found the Institute for Sexual Science in Berlin right after the First World War. This was the first scientific institute for the study of sex in the world, and it was also like a place where trans people could go to like get support from Hirschfeld. So they could go there to get their transvestite certificate approved. They could go there to like get a doctor's letter confirming a legal name change. The procedures for changing your name and getting a certificate were pretty complicated and difficult. Xavier Nunn is a historian who's doing research on this, and he found recently that it could take years and years and years to get all the paperwork to go through. So I don't want to overstate like how friendly the Weimar Republic was to trans people, but it's also like this is in the 1920s, this is kind of incredible to see this so early. And it's really exciting. Okay, so in Berlin in this period, like the German government was just really tolerant in comparison to the government Germany had before the First World War, which was the Kaiserreich. So under the democratic regime, they really relaxed censorship. And relaxed censorship was like a key issue for trans and queer people, because before the internet, there weren't a whole lot of ways to find other people who were like you. People were really isolated unless you could read a magazine or read a book and reach out to a community of people. This is Lottie Ham, who also went by Lothar. And Ham was a really important organizer in trans and queer subcultures in Berlin in the 1920s. And a lot of the work that Ham did was through this magazine called Girlfriend. This is a picture from Girlfriend magazine, and in it, Ham is holding up a sign that says, "Hooray, girlfriend is back." And what had happened is the Weimar Republic had they still had like a kind of relaxed censorship mode. So they had seized one issue of the magazine and suppressed it, and then it reemerged after that. That to us, that's kind of intolerable censorship, which I think is good. We should not tolerate such but in comparison to the United States would not have allowed a magazine like this to be published at all, ever. So for the time period, like, that's quite relaxed censorship, but it's also something that people fought against. So Ham's point in this photograph is to say, we're celebrating the fact that we have reemerged after this moment of censorship, and to like affirm the rights of queer and trans people to publish these magazines. Ham identified initially as a lesbian, and then Ham identified as a transvestite, and did a lot of organizing for people we would call trans men, for trans people who were masculine. Let me show you another image. This is another image of Ham. Was kind of like, there's lots of photographs of Lottie Ham. I think Lottie Ham was kind of like the trans guy heartthrob of Berlin in the 1920s, like the dashing, right? Well, sorry for the siren baby. Okay, but also, like, just to underscore the importance of the magazines themselves, this is a couple of images from Girlfriend magazine. You can see Lottie Ham on the back there. A lot of what Ham did was to organize parties. Ham organized a moonlit cruise on the Spree River through the middle of Berlin to an overnight party that sounded super fun. And all kinds of, like, there's balls, masquerades. There was really like a very vibrant queer trans social scene going on. And this image on the left are all ads on the back of the magazine for different clubs. And you can see one of them's in Hamburg as well. And then that's the front too. So Girlfriend magazine was mostly for cisgender lesbians, and it published a lot of short fiction and essays and some photographs. And also had a transvestite section. If you scroll down that, that's the contents next to the photograph on the image on the right, you can see there's an item for transvestites coming out in this issue too. So it's joint cisgender, lesbian, trans, mostly trans women organizing through these magazines, but also Lottie Ham, trans guy. Okay, so super vibrant subcultures in Berlin in the 1920s, in part because of Hirschfeld's advocacy, but in part, like, I want to give credit to these people who are not quite as famous, like Lottie Ham, who really fought to create these subcultures. And also the people who fought to establish a democratic regime in Germany. That it was the democracy that made all this possible. Let me see, sorry. Okay, so one of my favorite examples of like how open Berlin was in the 20s and the 30s is the Eldorado nightclub. The Eldorado, it was a cabaret. This is a real photograph of one of its locations. The sign means "here is the right place to be." And I don't know if you could see like that image on the left. So that's the entrance, and there are these beautiful people painted on the entrance sign, and they look like maybe they're kind of winking, like they have a secret, right? Am I projecting that? I don't know. So Eldorado was famous in many countries as a place where if you an assumedly not transgender or cisgender, like cisgender people, you came to Berlin, you want to see the sights, you're going to see the famous buildings, you're going to see the famous nightlife, and like if you're very daring, you could go to the Eldorado and see the transvestites who work there. It was famous for its trans performers, particularly for the beautiful trans women who danced there, stage performers, queer stage performers who weren't trans as well. Some beautiful like queer male dancers danced at the Eldorado. A lot of the dance was risque, without a lot of clothing. There was a whole controversy in the Weimar Republic about naked dance, and the government eventually decided that you couldn't dance naked, but you could dance with basically a bikini or some minimal covering, or you could be naked if you were completely still. It was one of these like thing. You read the judicial decision, and there's toward this like the judges tortured logic. But anyway, they got to this place where it was possible to be completely still on stage naked, but mostly what people did was to have like a sort of minimal costume. Yeah, so El Dorado like had stage performances. There was an orchestra. This is a photograph of the interior of El Dorado, people dancing. And it also had what was called taxi dancing, which some people in the audience may have heard of taxi dancing. I know my partner's grandmother was a taxi dancer during the Second World War and was kind of proud of it. So I have known what it was for a long time. But it's kind of a cross between being a dance instructor. I mean, I'll say for Grandma Cindy, it was the dance instructor, but for some people it could kind of veer a little bit into sex work. But it was like you'd go to the club and you pay the dancer to dance with you. And these trans women were like beautiful and wearing evening gowns, and they were really good dancers, and you could pay for a dance. And that was like very exciting, right? So in part, the El Dorado, it's a little creepy because it's like making money off of curious tourists who are kind of gawking at like the gay people and the trans people. But it also was kind of awesome because it like created a lot of jobs for gay and trans people, and it also was a way for trans people to like showcase their performing abilities. So yeah, a club like this in another country probably would have been shut down. And it was tolerated in Berlin. And the Berlin police had been super tolerant of gay and trans queer subcultures for a long time, but particularly under the Weimar Republic. This club is listed in guidebooks like that came out in England. People talk about, you should really go see the El Dorado if you dare. It's like a very risque kind of thing to do. So yeah, so Germany, it's hard for us to wrap our heads around this because we know like what's going to happen when Hitler comes to power. But in 1932, it was one of the best places in the world to be gay or transgender. Okay, so let's talk about. Oh, here's another example. This is the world's first lesbian bar guide, written by this woman Ruth Rolig, who was somebody who published a lot in the lesbian magazines and wrote this book, which if you're curious, you may be able to find a copy online, at least in German. It describes like about a dozen bars for women in Berlin. They're all different, and she has these kind of lavish descriptions of like the dress codes in the different bars and like the kinds of women who hung out there. And it's quite fascinating. But yeah, so I think when we think Germany, we think Nazi Germany often when you think the first half of the 20th century, but like this is the first lesbian bar guide. It came out in the 20s in Berlin. You can see Magnus Hirschfeld wrote the foreword. Okay, so 1933, Hitler came to power in January. All of this changed. A lot of it came crashing down immediately. The Nazis, they did not like come to power because they were against gay people and trans people. Gay and trans people in the 1920s and 1930s, like we were not that kind of wedge issue that we became at the end of the 20th century and certainly today. I spent a lot of time as a graduate student looking at the newspapers around the time that Hitler came to power, and there's almost nothing about queer and trans people. It's just not a wedge issue. It's not something that a lot of people are talking about in public. Hitler came to power because of the Great Depression. So if you want to take away, the unregulated American stock market crashed because of the greed of lots of people, and that caused a wave of global trauma. A third of Germans were unemployed, and a lot of those people went to the polls and voted for Hitler because they wanted a radical solution and they were comfortable with racism. So it's certainly not the case that like Berlin got too gay or too trans and then we got the Nazis. There's not a functional connection there. However, when the Nazis did come to power, they were kind of anxious to quickly make a point of cracking down on queer and trans subcultures. And the reason for that is that there was a gay guy in the Nazi party. His name was Ernst Röhm. The other Nazis generally did not know he was gay, but he had been outed right before Hitler was appointed chancellor. He was outed in 1932. So they were kind of anxious to like projects this image of really not being gay. And they did. In the first months of the regime, they destroyed they destroyed Hirshfeld's Institute for Sexual Science. And they didn't just destroy it, they made a big media festival out of destroying it. These are, I mean, you can see this photograph is staged on the right. So that's what happened, is that a bunch of Nazi students went to the institute during the day and just ripped it apart, like tore all the books out of the bookshelves. And there's photographs of like big piles of stuff. And if you look really closely, these are piles of like left-wing magazines about marriage reform, about the idea was that heterosexual marriage, men and women should have equality in marriage. They should both have sexual satisfaction. Like that was one of the things that Hirschfeld and people he worked with advocated. So that's what's being destroyed, right? And they're kind of, I always think it's funny that they also have, they told the students to pretend to be reading the material, which is like, I thought the whole point was not to read the bad, But so then, as you probably know, the Nazis had a lot of these symbolic book burnings right around the time that they took power, showing Germans how they were purging German intellectual life of the work of Jewish people, leftists, whether they were Jewish or not. And there was a big one in Berlin, right near the Opera House. And a big part of what was burned there was Magnus Hirschfeld's library from the Institute. And they actually burned a bust of Hirschfeld. There's a press photograph of like them carting this statue of his head and throwing it on the fire. It was a super public repudiation of everything that he stood for, because he was Jewish, and also because he was a leftist on questions of sex, and because he was a defender of, especially of gay people, but also of trans people. For all of those reasons, like he was a real target, and his institute was a target. They also shut down a lot of the public cultures that people had enjoyed. So this is the El Dorado nightclub after Hitler took power. And you can see that this is also like a press photograph. They've put up swastikas on the nightclub. You can see the old sign underneath that big sign over those police officers, that says vote Hitler, list 1. So it's like electioneering for Hitler. Yeah, so pretty chilling for queer and trans people, right? They shut down all the magazines. A lot of the subcultures had to go underground. People felt isolated, people felt scared. Hirschfeld was not in Germany when this happened. He was in exile. He had been out of the country since 1930, and he didn't think it was safe to come back. But he actually was in a movie theater to see a movie, and there was a newsreel in front of the regular feature, and he saw newsreel footage of the Institute being destroyed. So he kind of witnessed this in exile. And it must have been terrifying for people, right? To go from this moment when everything was so open and tolerated to like a really different regime. Okay, so let me spend the rest of my time kind of talking about like how people navigated that. Okay, so the Nazi state went after trans people. I'm doing a project on police files, and I've gathered a number of police files from different archives around Germany where trans people got into trouble with the police. This is really different from Weimar. There is some police harassment in Weimar. I don't want to like super. I think sometimes when I talk about Weimar, it sounds like a gay and trans paradise. I mean, there are cases of people running into police trouble, but they're few and far between, and the level of trouble is like very different. So we're not talking about big prison sentences. We're talking about like maybe you'll get a fine for cross-dressing, and often people were protected by those certificates. So the certificates, which were so important, are generally not respected by the Nazi police, or they're explicitly revoked. I'm going to talk about a case in a little bit where the cops actually went to the person in question and took the certificate away. But also, like, again and again, I've seen in files that police either revoke them or don't respect them. So the person gets arrested for cross-dressing. She says, I have a certificate. The police are like, what certificate? We don't, who cares? Like, we're not doing that anymore. the laws that they used against trans people were two, the first two laws you see here, so that's paragraph 183 and paragraph 360, which both are basically public indecency laws. The United States had similar laws in a lot of states, as did a lot of other countries, and they're not only used against trans people, but they are used against trans people. They're anti-cross-dressing laws. Of course, trans people, when we're dressed in the clothing that is the clothing of our own like gender, we're not cross-dressed, as Susan Stryker, the historian, said. We're just dressed. I love that. But yeah, so using, however, like in the law, that's considered cross-dressed. And you could be arrested for it. And I have seen cases where particularly trans women were arrested for cross-dressing. The other law that was used, again, in particular against trans women, it was paragraph 175. If you've like come to other lectures or read about this, you maybe already know about paragraph 175. It was Germany's national law against what was called sodomy, or what we would call consensual adult male sex, was illegal. Lots of countries had laws against male sex. Also a number of countries had gender neutral laws against same-sex sex. So Austria, for example, so in some cases, like lesbian sex was also criminalized, but in a lot of countries, these laws were gender specific to male sex. The United States had laws on the books until 2003, when the Supreme Court struck them down. So the paragraph 175 predates the Nazi state, but the Nazis rewrote it and made it harsher. And often trans women, when they got into trouble with the police, they would be accused under paragraph 175. Although they were women, the Nazi police refused to see them as women, and if they were having relationships with men, then those would be construed as gay relationships, and they could be charged. Okay, so let me talk through just a number of the cases that I've found to kind of show you the level of violence, but also the kinds of twists and turns that can happen. The first is a case of a woman. I don't know what her, I know she had a woman's first name that she used, and I don't know what it was, so I'm just going to refer to her by her initial. Her name was H. Bode. She lives in Hamburg. She had a transvestite certificate under Weimar. When the Nazi state came in, the police no longer respected that certificate, and she had a number of arrests and convictions for, or in charges for cross-dressing, and also for having sexual relationships with men. The arrest that led to her murder took place when one night she went out to a bar with her aunts. Bode was dressed as a woman and passed as a woman at the bar. They got chatting with some soldiers who had just come back from the war in Poland. This is early on in the Second World War. And they were all having drinks together at a table, and then suddenly one of the soldiers jumped up and said, "Oh, wait, you're not a woman, you're a man in woman's clothing." And the soldiers grabbed her and brought her to a police officer who was walking a beat, and she was arrested, and she was eventually charged under paragraph 175, and they also brought a cross-dressing charge against her. She had several convictions already, so the police decided to escalate her case. They called in a medical examiner. The medical examiner wrote this like horrible report where he finds that she's a transvestite and a homosexual and a psychopath and all kinds of bad things. And they start using this kind of language in her file, which is always a really bad sign for people. So at one point they wrote in her file, quote, this is the police writing about her. "It cannot be denied that a man going about in women's clothing is not in keeping with prevailing concepts of discipline and morality. Under the current state, a state of manly outlook, it is not permissible that a man counterfeit the other sex by wearing women's clothing." So to me as a historian, this was really interesting because they're referring directly to the fascist state here, the state of manly outlook. In fascism, like male dominance and masculinity were really important. So what they're saying is like, look, we have fascism. We can't have this kind of behavior going on. We can't have a trans woman. it's in direct violation of like what fascism is. So we have to do something about her. And indeed, they decided to send her to a concentration camp. They sent her to Buchenwald, where she was murdered in 1943. So on the one hand, what I want to emphasize is like, this is pretty horrible and sad. Yeah, this is pretty horrible and sad, right? Okay, let me give you another case. Liddy Backroft, Bodhi Ashton has done really interesting work on her, and if you want to know more, please like Google her and Google Bodhi's name, and you can see like he did a talk about her, and he has a piece coming out about her. Her file is just remarkable because it's so rich. We have a photograph of her. This is her. There are essays that she wrote about her life that Bodhi talks about. We have a really good sense of like what her personality was like, and she was also like just a really remarkable, super savvy, super tough, super determined woman. She also had a transvestite certificate under Weimar. She made her living selling sex in Hamburg, and she writes in the file about like being content and even happy with sex work as a way to make a living. She apparently was like really good at it, had lots of clients, supported herself. Her clients, there's lots of evidence in the file that her clients thought that she was a cisgender woman. She ran into trouble with police on a number of occasions. And this is something that I've seen across the files I looked at, that like when trans women were doing sex work, they were even more at risk of police violence, which is true today as well. She has Backroff had a number of arrests, and finally they determined that similar to Bodhi's case, they start using this horrible language about her and determine that she's unredeemable and she's a danger to the Nazi state and the people's community, the Nazi community, and they sent her to Mauthausen, where she was murdered also. So again, like a pretty sad story. But I think it's really important to just remember this violence. It's remarkable to me, but until not that many years ago, we weren't talking about the murder of trans women in the concentration camps at all. And both Backroff especially had been written about by historians, and Boda too, actually, but sometimes historians would identify them as men, as gay men, which they were not. They both are pretty clear about that. The police actually would interrogate you about your gender identity if they could figure out that you were a transvestite. That was like more concerning to them than just being gay. So there's a lot of paperwork in the file about it, and you can see like what people told the police. And Backroff was like super forthcoming. At one point she said, "My sense of my gender is fully and completely that of a woman." And there's lots of evidence that she lived her life as a woman as much as she possibly could, given that the police were constantly harassing her. Okay, here's a third case. So it's Pride Month, and I also want to talk about trans survival. And so I'm really happy to be able to talk about Toni Simon, who's somebody whose file has like recently come to my attention. I'm sorry I don't have a photograph of her. She was from Essen, and so I put this photograph of Essen synagogue, and I do want to talk about like the role that Judaism and race plays in all of this. Essen had a famous and really beautiful synagogue that was destroyed during Kristallnacht, but it was restored in the 1980s, and you can go and see it today. This is a postcard. Toni Simon was not Jewish. Nor was Backroff, nor was Boda. So none of the three trans women I've talked about so far were Jewish. They were all quote unquote Aryan. Okay, so Toni Simon also had a transvestite certificate under Weimar. And she even published an essay in one of the in Girlfriend magazine. Like, she was somebody who wrote an essay for the magazine. So it's pretty cool to find a person who's not famous, like, so well documented. By the time the Nazis came to power, she'd been living as a woman for quite a few years. The police in Essen already didn't like her because even before Hitler took power, she was running an underground bar where trans and gay people hung out. When Hitler took power, they went to her and explicitly took away her transvestite certificate and told her she could no longer wear women's clothing. They forbade her to do so in public. So that was like a forced detransition for Toni Simon. She responded by leaving town and fleeing the country. She lived abroad for a while. Then she came back. She spoke out against the Nazi regime at one point when she was living in Stuttgart. She was tried under there was a Nazi era law against criticizing the regime. She was tried and convicted, served a year in prison. She was released from prison, and it seemed like she was going to make her way back to Essen finally. And there's lots of paperwork in the file. The Essen police got a report that Toni Simon was coming back to Essen after she'd been released from prison, and at that point they had had enough. So there are these reports back and forth where the Gestapo is like, we're going to arrest her, we're going to send her to a camp. And again, they start using this very this frightening language about her, right? I gave it to you on the slide here. In addition to her transvestite inclinations, she's a pronounced homosexual. She has always promoted homosexuality. That was like running the underground bar. She'll do so in the future. She's a danger to young people. May sound familiar. A concentration camp is absolutely necessary. Okay, so what's so wonderful about this file is that it ends there. So usually if the person gets arrested, there's arrest paperwork, and then there's camp paperwork, and then there's like a report of the death. Toni Simon's file just ends. So I took her name and I ran it through the International Tracing Service. Thank you to the people there who helped me, which is a really super useful collection of documents from the camp system. If you Google ITS, International Tracing Service, and they will turn up. You can actually run a search yourself, and then they can run a more advanced search, and there's nothing on her. I have her date of birth too, so she's not in that system. So I am somewhat confident to say that I think she made it. She was biking towards Essen, and they were gonna arrest her, and she must have biked in the other direction. so wonderful, hopefully somebody who survived, but who ran a serious risk because she was trans. Okay. I'm a little bit down on my time. Okay, so two final thoughts to leave you with. One is that in not all cases are the police as aggressive and violent as they are in the three cases I talked about. Police get aggressive and violent, especially against trans women, especially when they sell sex or have a lot of relationships with men. In other cases, sometimes the police back off. So I'm giving you this case of GW, a trans guy, from Berlin. This case really falls on the other side of the spectrum, where police are going kind of easy in comparison. But just to kind of show you the range. Okay, so this is somebody who was referred by the labor office, that basically the labor service is like supposed to get you a job, and if you can't get a job, eventually we're gonna send you to some kind of compulsory labor. And GW had this problem that I talked about before, like my first name doesn't match my gender presentation. Police investigated, but eventually decided not to bring charges. And GW said, well, why don't you reissue my certificate to cross-dress or let me change my name? And the police said, no, we don't, we're not going to do that. But they also said, look, just go home. Don't cause public offense. So that means, like, if you're going to go out in public dressed as a man, you better pass as a man so that people don't report you. But like, if nobody complains, just kind of get out of our hair, man. Okay. So there's a trans people in Nazi Germany are running a serious risk. But it's a risk that can be navigated. And there are cases where police are like not as violent. Another thing that I super want to leave you with is like, race made an enormous difference. So if you were somebody who was not like officially Aryan, if you were racialized as Jewish or Black or Polish, you were running a very different kind of risk, and it was a much bigger risk. This is Charlotte Charlock. She was a trans woman who was Jewish, who did a lot with Magnus Hirschfeld, like spent time at the Institute, worked with him. She fled the country shortly after Hitler took power and lived the rest of her life in New York City, actually. This is a new biography of her that just came out that's super cool. That people should check out if you read German. But I think, like, you know, important to remember that like Jewish women, Jewish men were just facing a very different situation. This is another case. So this is a person who was queer but not trans, Friederike B. From Vienna, probably a lesbian. So in Austria's law against same-sex sex covered lesbian sex, and she was accused of having lesbian sex. She was questioned by the police in Vienna, interrogated, and then they let her go because they didn't have enough evidence to charge her. However, she was probably murdered. Again, the paper trail kind of runs out, but in this case, there are indications that she was sent to a camp and didn't survive because she was Jewish. So Jewish people are running like an enormous risk in this system that is hyper violent against them. And some of those Jewish people were trans and some of them were queer. And I think we have to like really keep that in mind when we're talking about queer and trans persecution. You know, even these cases that are so horrible, Boda had repeated convictions. Boda could have hired a lawyer. Right, the fact that you're Aryan makes a difference. Had Boda been Jewish, the legal system wouldn't have necessarily treated her that differently, but she would have been put on a train and sent to a death camp by a part of the state running parallel to the legal system, right? The Gestapo were responsible for sending people to camps, right? Essen's Jewish community was destroyed in the Holocaust. And the fact that Toni Simon was not Jewish gave her some protection. However, she was still running a risk as a trans woman. Okay. See if I. Okay. Yeah. So just to kind of wrap up, for Pride Month, it's just it's super exciting to be like telling these stories of trans life in Germany in the 1920s, and even under the Nazi state, trans survival. And it's also like a time to really grieve our trans elders who were murdered, and also to think about the difference that race makes. I think that's a really important lesson for the present as well, that racialization can really affect the way transphobia and homophobia play out, and that we have to be thoughtful about that. But it's also just like, as a historian, it's so exciting to be telling you these stories because this is research that is just happening now. Like, this is really scholarship that people like Bodhi Ashton, Xavier Nunn, Raymond Wolfert, who wrote this book, like this is all coming out now. And it's super exciting. And I think it's really neat just to, as much as the violence, we ought to be horrified by the violence. I also think it's just amazing to remember the subcultures that people built so early in the 20th century. That trans people are not new. Their persecution is not new either, but like trans people are not new. We've been around for like quite a while now, and yeah, and that's exciting to see that too. Okay, so thank you very much. Happy Pride, everybody.
Thank you so much, Laurie. This was such a fascinating and really needed presentation. So I really appreciate you being here with us today. So before we move on to audience Q&A, I do, just because you mentioned Bodhi. Bodhi was part of our program last year, Transgender Experiences in Weimar and Nazi Germany, which I'm linking to in the chat. So I also highly encourage you all to check out that program as well. So just wanted to shout that out before we move on. So I want to start with this really interesting question. So we talked a lot about Berlin before the war. Was Berlin representative or exceptional when it comes to trans life in Germany prior to World War II?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, there's a lot of like back and forth in the scholarship about that. So it's somewhat like Berlin is the capital of these subcultures, but it's quite amazing if you look at places that are lesser known. You'll also find like bars, clubs, social organizations, political organizations, even in I think there's a book's going to come out about Warsaw that I'm really excited about, like even kind of like to the east, in urban centers. And there's also evidence that like in little towns there are people making their lives. So, but yeah, I would say that Berlin, in its openness, in the police toleration, it's pretty unique. Hamburg is somewhat similar, but Hamburg doesn't have the famous nightlife. I mean, there's lots of famous nightlife in Hamburg, but like they don't have the El Dorado, they don't have the Institute for Sexual Science. So somewhat unique, but like surprisingly not as unique as we might think.
Mhm. And then you talked a lot about Magnus Hirschfeld's Institute for Sexual Science, and how you said that he was not in Germany when the institute was destroyed. But what happened to the other people who were affiliated with the institute after 1933?
Yeah, so when the institute was destroyed, they didn't arrest anybody. They just wrecked the library and shut it down. Um, so the institute was like mostly a scientific institute where doctors worked, and a lot of those doctors fled. A good number of them were Jewish and they were left of center, and a lot of them worked on birth control, and Germany wasn't safe for them. Some ended up in Israel or the United States. For the trans and queer people who hung out at the institute, I mean, it's like if they were Jewish, they probably thought about fleeing, like Charlotte Charlotte did. If they weren't, the Nazi years are a time when like if you're Aryan and you're gay or trans, like maybe you're like, I'm gonna try to keep my head down. I mean, some people joined the Nazi movement. So even though they were queer, an example of that is Ruth Rolig, who wrote the guidebook, the first lesbian guidebook. So she actually like this guidebook was suppressed, but she was able to go on having a career in Nazi Germany. She was Aryan. She joined the National Writers Association and she wrote an anti-Semitic novel. And she was still a lesbian and she lives with her girlfriend in her big apartment, and kind of kept that quiet.
Mhm.
So yeah, if you were Aryan, that was also an option for people. Um, yeah.
Thank you. So then I think just to kind of move into some questions sort of about like what do you most want people to know about trans people and their experiences in the Holocaust? I mean, we went over a lot of information. So what, if you had to give, I guess, one takeaway, what do you think it would be?
Yeah, I think it's really important to remember just how old trans history is and how for that we've always been here. We've always had trans people. So if you look at the period before the Nazis took power, those subcultures, I think a lot of people don't know about that, but it's good to know that like there have been trans magazines and subcultures and clubs and cabarets for more than 100 years now. This is not a new thing. And also just to remember that like the persecution of trans people, which we're seeing a real anti-trans movement right now from the Republican Party in the United States. And it seems like it's becoming a wedge issue. That is a lot like what the Nazis did to trans people. That the right sometimes goes after trans people. And I think it's like a really ugly history that I wish the Republican Party would repudiate rather than doing a version of it now. Banning trans medicine, banning drag shows, right? Banning kids from playing sports, all that stuff. Yeah.
Thank you. And then this is kind of shifting topics, but I think we'll come back to this in a second. You talked a lot about a lot of sources that are published in German. And I'm kind of taking a question from one of our audience members and rephrasing it a little bit. Do you have resources that you would recommend besides your own work, which is excellent, but any other resources that are published in English? And also, do you know if people can find Magnus Hirschfeld's work in English at all?
Yeah. So so Michael Lombardi Nash, and a couple of other people have translated some of Hirschfeld's work.
Mhm.
If you um if you put in Amazon Hirschfeld English translation or Google, Lombardi Nash is spelled Lombardi-Nash.
Mhm.
And then in terms of other resources, yeah, a lot of stuff is still in German, which is kind of too bad. I'm trying to think about what's in it. Xavier Nunn, last name Nunn, has a really good essay that just came out in English. That is a look at one woman's case. Let me try to think of some other resources for people. Everybody should go see the new Transparent musical. To see Magnus Hirschfeld and the Institute for Sexual Science. That just premiered last night. I wish there was more in English. Bodhi's work. Yeah. I'm probably forgetting something important.
If you think of anything, we can also send it out later. So, just to put it in your head. So then I'm gonna kind of, I think, combine a couple questions here. Is there in Germany, and I think you also talked about Austria, and we talked a little bit about Warsaw for a second. Is there recognition of the communities that were lost during this time? Like, do they talk about that there, or is it not recognized? The trans and LGBTQ plus communities vibrant.
In Germany, there's a lot of recognition. Austria, I'm not so sure. In Warsaw, I don't know at all. Whether there's recognition, but Germany, there's pretty good public recognition, particularly around Hirschfeld. I actually kind of think he's over. I wish we would remember some of the other people too. But yeah, Hirschfeld is pretty well remembered. And that's partially thanks to like gay activists. He was completely forgotten after the Second World War. And then in the 1980s, there were activist students in Berlin who rediscovered him and over the subsequent decades, like brought him back to national public memory in Germany. So now in Germany, like there's stuff named after him, and there've been a lot of exhibits, and there's a pretty strong memory of just how queer Berlin was in the 20s. The trans stuff, I think less so. But yeah, it's pretty, I would say it's pretty well remembered. More than in the US.
Thank you. And just to answer a question that just came in, the name of the musical that you were talking about is the Transparent musical, correct?
Yeah, it's called A Transparent Musical. Or is it called The Transparent Musical? Yeah, it's a musical. There was a show a while ago, and it's a musical. Same, some of the same creators. It's great.
So I think we have time for maybe one or two more questions before we wrap up.
Yes, starring Peppermint. Yes.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
Thank you. So, I think we kind of touched on this, but if you want to add anything, what do these stories and archives teach us? Like, what can we learn from going into the archives specifically?
Oh yeah, let me just respond to something that so Gay Berlin, Robert Beachy's book Gay Berlin is good too. It's really about like cisgender gay men, but yeah, that's another thing in English that's good to read about this. So what can we learn by going into the archive? I mean, I love going into the archives because you find out about these incredible people who weren't famous and who didn't leave behind papers. Magnus Hirschfeld, like he published a lot of books. Toni Simon, we probably wouldn't know about her at all if she didn't have a police file, but she was a pretty amazing person. And also you get a sense of just how, the grassroots working of the state and like how violence unfolded for people in their actual lives, which I think is really important. I mean, it's one thing to say like, yeah, they went after people, and it's another to read like the story of one person. This is just true in general, and I'm sure a lot of people have had this experience, but you just have a much richer understanding from one person's story, and we can really only get that from the archives, unless the person wrote a memoir, which is like awesome when people did, and there's some amazing memoirs. But yeah, not so much for trans people.
And actually that kind of leads into another question that came in. Are there trans survivors who gave video or audio testimonies that you draw on in your research or that you know of? Or is it mainly archival records and memoirs?
Yeah, okay, so good question. So there was a big effort to interview survivors, especially in the 90s, and that is an amazing archive. I think it's like, I mean, you probably know, but it's almost 100,000 interviews, maybe between the different projects, like
Mhm.
tens of thousands of interviews. There are, okay, so in that archive, as far as I know, there are not any people who identify as trans.
Mhm.
There are people who identify as gay,
Mhm.
and there are lesbian, like there are gay men survivors, and there are also lesbians, Jewish lesbian survivors.
Mhm.
Anna Haikova, who's also somebody who I think was on the panel before, has done remarkable research on Jewish women queer Jewish women who survived or who didn't survive. But yeah, to my knowledge, like we don't have anything from a trans person. Um, yeah.
And then I want to end with just one last question. What matters most to you and what drives you in maintaining this work?
Um,
Tough one.
it's, I mean, it's just it's so interesting, and it's exciting for historians when we thought we knew something and then we found out we were totally wrong. So like when I was in graduate school, we didn't talk at all about trans people. And I kind of didn't even realize there were trans people in the 20s in Germany. And then suddenly I went to the archive and I was like, what's this? Oh my God, it's a magazine called The Transvestite. Like, what's that? So just the way that like really careful archival work can overturn what we thought we knew. And show us people's real lives and like these glimpses into people's incredible stories. That's a real like something that keeps me going.
Well, I want to give you a chance if you have any kind of concluding remarks or anything else you want to say. I don't want to cut you off or anything like that, but I think that was an excellent way to end. So
Yeah. No, just thanks everybody for coming and happy Pride Month. And
yeah. So Laurie, I want to thank you so much again. This it really means a lot that you're here with us. So thank you again for sharing your research with us and sharing your knowledge. It's really meaningful. Um, and I also want to thank everybody who joined us today and asked great questions and was here with us today. It also means a lot. If you enjoyed today's program, we hope you'll consider making a donation to support the museum. And also joining us for our upcoming programs, which you can find at mghnyc.org/current events.